an interesting perspective on matters strategic thinking. Well, just before we get started with our discussion, let's set the base. President Uhuru Kenyatta has advised the next administration not to shy away from using debt, even as he noted its importance as a key accelerator of economic development. This comes as Treasury proposes an increase in the debt ceiling from 9 trillion shillings to 10 trillion shillings in order to finance the budget deficit for the financial year starting July 1st, 2022. Brenda Kerubo now takes a look at that.
Then Uhuru Kenyatta stepped up borrowing when he took over office in 2013. His main area of focus were to deliver key infrastructure projects with the hope of doubling economic activity. The projects were around port, road, railway, health and energy. This drove up the debt to gross domestic product, which compares what a country owes with what it produces to over 60% versus just over 40% when he took office. The president has always defended his administration's appetite for borrowing, and in the last national event speech during the Madaraka Day celebrations, he noted that debt helped close our infrastructure gap and to connect our markets.
How much is too much borrowing? When does borrowing become too much and unbearable to a nation? The only time debt is a burden to a nation is if a nation is led by looters. But in the hands of a visionary administration, debt is a catalyst for rapid development.
Critics have, however, faulted Kenyatta's government of slapping the country with huge repayment obligations. According to the International Monetary Fund, Kenya's debt is at high risk of distress. Yields on benchmark 10-year notes have almost doubled since January to 11.22%, suggesting investors will demand a hefty premium for any new issuance. Treasury plans to issue another $1 billion Eurobond debt to plug a budget deficit projected at 8.1% of gross domestic product in the year through June. It also plans to raise the debt ceiling to 10 trillion shillings.
Today, I am proud to record that if the third Kenyan administration built 2,000 kilometers of tarmac road, we accelerated this achievement by building over 11,000 kilometers, which is close to 6 times what they built.
National Treasury has raised the target for tax collections for this financial year to 1.74 trillion shillings for the fiscal year ending June from 1.71 trillion shillings. But rating agency Moody's has warned that the government's ability to roll over its $2 billion Eurobond 2024 maturity will rely on its ability to issue another Eurobond, because such a sizable maturity will be difficult to meet from domestic sources. Brenda Kerubo, KTN News.
All right, that sets the base for our discussion this afternoon, and we are now joined by Uhuru Ndoho, Ken Gishinga and Odhiambo Ramogi. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for making time to be with us. And Gishinga, let me start off with you. What's your immediate assessment of that very bold statement from a president who is literally in his last months in service?
Many thanks, Abi. Indeed, debt, when it's at moderate levels and applied well, can help a country to be able to bridge some of its gaps. But that's not the situation in Kenya. If you go back to 2013 and you look at the revenue collected and the debt we had in that time, revenue collected in Kenya has gone up about twice.
Yes.
But debt has gone up almost 5 times. If you are running a business and you are comparing the last 10 years and your incomes have gone up twice, your assets have gone up twice, but your liabilities have gone up 5 times, no board would extend your mandate.
All right.
Because net, you've held the country backwards. Debt has a way of crowding out the private sector. In the next 1 month, they'll be launching an infrastructure bond, which is going to take away about 20 billion from the market. Now that 20 billion could have gone into building hotels, building houses, building markets. So this is money that could have been gone to create jobs. So in as much as we say it's been used for infrastructure, we need to ask, has it contributed to household incomes going up? And that's not the case, because infrastructure is not an end in itself. Infrastructure is a means to an end. So if that infrastructure has allowed household incomes to go up, then we can say it's a good use. So I'd like to see the next president say in his last Madaraka Day speech that when I assumed office, the household income was 30,000 shillings, and as I'm leaving office, the average household income is 60,000 shillings. Then we can say it's, but that's not the case in Kenya.
All right, that's a very cogent point. But Gishinga, don't you also believe that the infrastructure is really important, Uhuru, in the sense that it's expected to create economic activities around that infrastructure that has come in, be it a port, be it a superhighway, be it the expressway. I mean, the president is on record also saying that other countries did not fear to take debt. He gave an example of South Korea, Singapore, saying some of these countries were among the top most indebted nations several years back. Today, the same cannot be said about them. They are in the Super League when it comes to growth.
Yes, look, it's a difficult one to justify. I mean, for 10 years, we can understand 20 years of growing the infrastructure. But it is not a perpetual motion machine. You can't keep borrowing. At some point, you have to pivot. And to my colleague's point, you absolutely have to pivot to the human resource, how you make it such that you deploy it productively to earn an income. The other thing, there's a couple of other dynamics that are not mentioned in this speech. One of them is, those examples are given. The one thing that's always missed out is these economies were extremely disciplined fiscally. It was borrowed, but it was put to very, very targeted use. And even then, the twin to that borrowing was a very controlled public expenditure. So in other words, they were borrowing specifically to ensure that not only are they building their infrastructure, but the machinery of government was as efficient as possible. And they sustained that over that time. And so in the midst of all this, the sense in which I fear that yes, you could justify it to some extent up to this point, but there's no way you can justify it going forward. It's about time we pivoted. And I think when also the citizenry are also saying this is too much, I think it behooves as well as leaders to say, okay, there's clearly an outer boundary which we're about to cross, because the pain is not felt normally. And see, this is moral hazard in public leadership, in that I get to borrow and spend, but you get to pay. And that moral hazard is true in every government. And so that's why you need the second part of fiscal discipline, because I'm borrowing on your behalf, because I know you're feeling the pain, but I'll spend it in such a way that you get to see the benefit also, beyond just nice roads. I mean, the express is wonderful, but if you've been on it, it's like floating. You're floating in your car and leaving all the poor people down there as you go from point A to point B.
But there's a price to pay for this.
There is, but I think this is the debate which, in a sense, needs to be closed. We have done a very good job with the infrastructure, with the borrowing. But it's time to pivot, because you cannot indefinitely keep doing that. And we must begin to see the issues of discipline around fiscal expenditure. If you ask me right now, we don't have any headroom to borrow anymore. So where's that going to come from? Unless you cut expenditure, and that would be one of my first proposal to the incoming administration, cut the public service, move that money to the private sector, stop borrowing. I would actually say refinance, restructure the entire debt portfolio to lower the yield curve, to lower the cost of debt, because that's possible. The options were around how you do that, because you do that in the private sector. You borrowed expensive money, you can refinance it for cheaper money. But once you do that, you have to have very clearly where that money is going. And it has to go right down to Wanjiko, right down to the businesses, SMEs. 80% of the labor force is employed by SMEs. That's where the money should be going.
All right. So no single economist on this table believes debt is the way out for Kenya. But hold your thoughts. I don't know if we have, Ramogi on the line. Ramogi.
Yeah, Abi.
All right, Ramogi, quite an interesting narrative coming out here, of course, around debt. And President Kenyatta is indicating that the next administration should not fear to borrow more, because we need to use other people's money to develop our own economy. What are your thoughts on this? Is this a sustainable argument?
Well, first of all, I think I, for one, agree with my colleague Uhuru that the next administration should resist from borrowing anymore. We have gone a very accelerated development program, and the arguments for or against are there. But now we cannot sustain it for another 10 or 5 years, for that matter. The next administration should focus on development. And actually, I think from what I hear, there's a lot of focus on agriculture, there's a lot of focus on manufacturing, and most of them do not require a lot of borrowing, but infrastructure development will require a lot of borrowing. And so for me, infrastructure should go towards the back seat from the front seat. But I want to comment on the president's speech in two fronts. One is the issue of governance, which he raised and said that unless, of course, there is a lot of looting happening. The truth of the matter is, in his administration, we have had enough looting and too many corruption cases. And that should tell him just how much wasted we have had. We are borrowing, yes, but that money is not circulating in the economy as he would expect. And so on that one, he is right that looting slows down development when you borrow, and the looting in his administration slowed down development significantly. But on the other hand, also, I want to say that when you look at the Jubilee administration overall, there has been negative economic growth. I mean, the graph is downwards, with the last year's growth being an outlier. Before that, it was an average of 5%, which was the same as under Kibaki's administration. And so when you look at the indicators tell a different narrative, that the borrowing, the excessive borrowing that they did not yield the desired growth that they desired. In fact, it has brought us to a worse position. Even when you look at the poverty levels, the inequalities, they are all indicating that we are worse off today, courtesy of that borrowing and accelerated development program, than we were 10 years ago. And so if the next administration makes the same mistake, I think we'll be in trouble. All right.
And you raise a very, very valid point, and I'd like to hear Gishinga's thoughts as well as Uhuru. One of the proposals by the candidates who are running for presidency in Azimio is saying that he will implement the Ndungu report, which bars civil servants from engaging in business. And the looting issue has come out from the sense that we have employees who are bidding for tenders that for organizations they work for. We've seen this, for instance, with Kenya Power, where as we speak, there was a lifestyle audit that was to be conducted on staff, but the court orders came through. But what implications will this have in terms of shaping the workforce to just do your work and earn your pay decently?
I agree with you, Abi. Sometimes there is conflicts of interest when you have somebody who's working at a parastatal and the wife is supplying goods to the same parastatal. And to the extent that we can cure that, I think is powerful. But I think there's a fundamental point that incomes also in the public service are still quite low. And that's what fuels corruption. So in as much as you might say relatives or people should not do it, people will find proxies. Kenyans are very smart in finding proxies. So I think the true cure is how you give a good salary to somebody in that parastatal. They can live a comfortable life, so they don't even have to think of doing business. Until you cure that, people will always try to look. You lock one area, people will find other areas. So the true cure is how do we give just wages within our civil service? And that's what happens in many countries.
This was already implemented through performance contracting, where civil servants are fairly paid well compared to their counterparts in the private sector. But Uhuru, looking at the typical Kenyan entrepreneur, you are a civil servant. When you are out of work, perhaps you are a poultry farmer. And you realize your organization requires some of your products. And here is a policy that they want to implement, that civil servants cannot engage in private business.
You have to remember that part of the justification for allowing the public servants to do was precisely because at that time it was felt that it was restricting the newly independent Kenya and its servants from also benefiting from the economic growth that was going to happen. So even it's not even fit for purpose for what it was intended. To me, unless you grow the cake first, everything else is detail. The fact is that this cake has effectively shrunk. There's a point around the question of infrastructure where you don't even deploy your own human capital, but you use foreign capital, which then builds the road and then exports that same money overseas. Yeah, it means that the multiplier effect of even that has not been a benefit to Kenya.
The domestic economy.
It's the domestic economy. So there are structural things around fixing some of those things. But you cannot now, with a population of 50 million, continue on a path that benefits a very small group to the exclusion of the bigger group. And I think that's why this debate around debt is now an economic empowerment question, really, about the vast majority of the people. Yes, we have got infrastructure, but you can't keep going like that. Now people are asking, so even with the expressway, I still can't keep
infrastructure.
Well, I didn't want to say that, but that's what it was coming from. They're saying, you see, it's beautiful, but I'm hungry. I went home hungry last night. Tonight I'm hungry. So unless you find a way of releasing credit into society, unless you find ways of making sure that Kenyans, if they need to build a business, they're not being harassed by the same government or by Kajo. They have opportunities around that.
All right.
And that has to be at the heart of the next administration, whichever side comes from.
Interesting. And I'd like to pick your closing thoughts, Ramogi, in regards to this. What way forward?
Well, first of all, a point of correction, I think it's Ndegwa report of 1971.
Exactly. Sorry for that. Yeah.
No worries. Secondly, I agree with Gishing. Issue needs to be looked at, but I don't think it's an issue of just wages. I think it's an issue of inequalities. And finally, I agree with Raila that yes, we need to separate the public service from the private service. From the private sector. More than and competing with the people they are supposed to regulate doesn't make sense. And I hope that we can continue with that discussion more, because I think there's a lot to say around it.
All right. We seem to have a small challenge there with his connection, but the point is home. And gentlemen, our time is far much spent, and this is a very controversial subject on the Ndegwa report. We certainly need to revisit this because it has a lot of interest, not only from the audience, but also for the country that is just staring at a couple of days to the elections. Many thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Robbie.
All right, we want to go on a quick commercial break. On the other side of the break, we have BBC Money Daily, as well as Captains of Industry coming up. Don't go too far.